What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. So, I know a lot of times, people like to bash the Bulls from the 90s. And one of the arguments you hear from Chicago Bulls haters or Jordan haters is that they didn't really play anybody. They'll talk about the various injuries that some teams were suffering from in 91 when the Bulls won it all. And then sometimes they'll talk about the ineptitude of some of the players on some of the Bulls teams, the opponents, like the Knicks or the Jazz, or they'll say, well, what if Utah, instead of Greg Ostertag, what if they had Akeem, and all these straw man arguments, okay? At the end of the day, I'll just say this. When you think of the greatest Jazz teams of all time, you go back to the 90s. When you think of some of the best Sonics teams of all times, aside from the championship years of the late 70s and early 80s, you go back to the 90s. When you think of the great Suns teams of all time, you go back to the 90s. When you think of the greatest Portland Trailblazers teams that we've seen, you damn sure don't think about Dame Lillard. You tend to go back to the 90s outside of Bill Walton's championship brief window, right? So I'll leave that there. Most of those teams won 60 games or more, whatever the case may be. But if you want to play this game about trying to look at each championship run and seeing the holes that are there, then if we're going to do that with the Bulls, then we can do that with the Pistons. Because there's a lot of things that irritate me about these media narratives, this anti-Jordan media narrative that definitely has been prevalent over the past decade or so. You hear this thing about how Isaiah beat all these guys in their prime, right? He beat Magic, Larry, and Michael in their primes. Is that really true? Is that really true? Did Isaiah beat a healthy Magic Johnson in his prime? Did Isaiah beat a healthy Larry Bird in his prime? Was Michael Jordan's prime pre-1990? I mean, you could argue he did beat them, but when he did beat Larry Bird, Bird was hobbled with what was ultimately found out to be bone spurs. He had surgeries in the offseason and was never the same player again. And Magic had a very brief appearance in the one time in the series in which technically he beat Magic, but Magic wasn't available for most of that series. Let's focus on the 89 season, right? It was during that season that the Pistons went 63-19 and won their first ever NBA championship. It was also during that season, if I recall correctly, that they made the trade for Adrian Dantley. For Mark Aguirre. Adrian Dantley was a great scorer, but his style of play, although he boosted the Pistons offensively in many ways, his style of play didn't quite fit the schematics of what they were trying to do in Detroit with the players they had. Maybe he would have fit better 3 or 4 years earlier when it was him, it had been him and Kelly Tripucka and Isaiah Thomas. They were playing a more up-tempo, like to call it almost like Denver Nuggets type style of basketball, right? But their style of play was totally different, selfless, defensive orientated type basketball. Plus, we all know that Isaiah and Adrian Dantley loathe one another. To this day, they cannot stand one another. I mean, the hatred they have towards each other probably borders close to the hatred that RFK and LBJ had with each other. But anyway, Mark Aguirre was a better fit, and they performed significantly better with Mark Aguirre on the roster than they did with Adrian Dantley. I forgot the spread, but it was they were playing almost like 900 ball with Adrian Dantley. Without Adrian Dantley, excuse me. Anyway, one of the things I want to correct too, that some people like to say about the Pistons is, oh, well, Isaiah didn't have a whole bunch of help on his team. That's why these guys weren't making all NBA teams and they weren't all-stars, et cetera, et cetera. Let me tell you something. Isaiah Thomas may not have played with technically a lot of Hall of Fame players and a lot of guys that weren't all NBA players, but a lot of that had to do with the bias against players who aren't putting up big numbers. Because let me tell you something. Joe Dumars, Dennis Rodman, John Sally, Vinnie Johnson, Bill Laimbeer, and Mark Aguirre in their primes were either Hall of Fame players or borderline fringe star players. All of them. All of them. They were all capable of giving you double-digit scoring. All of them. All of them. You look at some of those Pistons teams from the 80s and late in the 80s and 90s, and you look at some of the box scores, sometimes these guys would go 6, 7, 8 deep as far as double-digit scoring. One of the reasons why Isaiah Thomas, after 1987, no longer appeared on MVP ballots and made as many All-NBA teams, part of it is, I do believe was payback for the Larry Bird comments, a little bit of that, but also because Isaiah Thomas sacrificed numbers for the betterment of the team. And when you look at stats and you see a Michael Jordan averaging this and Magic still putting up numbers, and you look and you see Mark Price putting up numbers and Tim Hardaway putting up numbers, you know, Kevin Johnson starting to put up numbers on Cleveland before he's traded to Phoenix, and you see all these other point guards putting up numbers, Fat Lever and other lesser point guards, Michael Adams putting up crazy inflated numbers on Nuggets teams. A guy like Isaiah Thomas, who skill-wise mops the floor with almost all of them. Well, if you're not doing your real research, if you're a beat writer or if you're somebody following the sport, you kind of take Isaiah Thomas for granted. He's putting up 18 points and 8 assists a night. So he's playing with a lot of talent. They may not be Hall of Famers. They weren't putting up gaudy numbers, but that team was the most talented team in basketball by 89. I don't refute that. What I do refute and what I do push back on is their level of competition. In 89, you know who they played in the first round? They played the Boston Celtics. Now, I didn't say 99. This ain't 99. This is 1989. So you have to ask yourself, well, how the hell are they playing the Boston Celtics in the first round? Because Larry Bird was out that entire year, save for, I think, 6 games, out with surgery. So Bird wasn't playing in 1989 in the playoffs. So without Larry Bird, they were not the same team, and they swept them in the first round. Kevin McHale was not the same player after the foot injury. Parrish was still good, but he was pushing 40. They weren't the same squad afterwards. Next round, they play a Milwaukee Bucks team that at that All-Star break was 30 and 15, excuse me. They were 30 and 15 at the All-Star break. They finished the season in the second half of the All-Star break 19-18. Why? Because of injuries. Matter of fact, they had injuries to four key players. Four key players going into that series in the semifinals. As a matter of fact, a fifth player got hurt during that series, and the Bucks had to get league permission to play that last game of that series, game 4, because they didn't have the prerequisite amount of players healthy, which at the time was 9. They only had 8 guys to dress. And even in that game, the Pistons fell behind by 20 points before they came back and beat them. By the way, Terry Cummings, their leading scorer and best player, didn't play in that series. Next series, they played the Chicago Bulls, who happened to be the only team that they played in that entire postseason that was healthy. The only team. They beat them 4-2 because, Scottie Pippen and Horace Grant were still developing. That was the last year, I believe, that Doug Collins was the head coach of that squad. But they did take them to 6 games. And in the finals, we all know that the Lakers, who were 11-0 coming out of the West, lost Magic Johnson and Byron Scott due to injury. Byron Scott got hurt before the series started, and Magic pulled his hamstring in game 1 of that series, and they got swept. But interestingly enough, with Jeff Lamp as the point guard, even though it was a 4-0 sweep, most of those games were still kind of competitive. But nobody ever plays what if Magic didn't get hurt? Or what if Byron Scott didn't? Nobody does that with the Pistons. Only with the Bulls. This anti-Jordan sentiment and narrative that permeates sports talk out of jealousy. Do you ever hear them really do this shit? And by the way, the next year, 1990, in the first round, the Pistons beat a 42-win Pacers team. The next round, they beat a 45-win, Knicks team, where in the one victory that the Knicks got in that series, Patrick Ewing went off for 45 points in a way that the Bulls never allowed him to go off when they played them in the 90s. And then in the conference finals, they play a Bulls team that takes them all the way to 7 games. All the way to 7 games. But guess what? Scottie Pippen has a migraine headache in game 7. Jordan shows up, 31 points, I think something like 9 rebounds, maybe 8 assists or some shit like that, right? Jordan shows up. Nobody else showed the fuck up. And they lose by 19. In the finals, they beat the Pistons. They beat a Blazers team, which more or less was the same damn team that the Bulls would beat 2 years later, except for Clyde Drexler was an MVP candidate in 92. So you tell me, where's these magical teams that the Pistons are beating in their championship run? And why is it that in both playoff runs, the best team, the most competitive team that they played against each time was the Bulls? So if the Bulls were such phonies, why is it that the Bulls were giving them so much hell? When on paper, the Bulls weren't the most talented. Maybe it truly is that despite the Jordan rules, Michael Jordan was really that fucking good. And all he needed was just a little bit of help from his quote unquote Jordanaires. And once that happened, the rest was history. Anyway, that's all I got to say about it.